durant en aquest darrer any s'han produït a Irlanda unes retallades socials enormes, han baixat els sous dels funcionaris significativament i els ajuts socials han baixat molt gran. Una gran diferència amb Grècia és que a Irlanda no hem sentit protestes, pràcticament no hi ha hagut massa protesta social, manifestacions. Em fa pensar que això ens diu que la societat irlandesa és una societat que accepta el fet que s'està passant per una crisi i que és molt disciplinada a l'hora d'aplicar aquestes retallades i no protesta. M'agradaria que comentés aquesta visió per entendre per què la societat irlandesa, a diferència de la grega o d'altres, no està reaccionant de manera més contundent, sinó molt amablement, diríem.
Well, I think the Irish voters waited in the long grass. They didn't go out and protest on the streets, as happened in Greece and has happened elsewhere, but rather they waited in the long grass until we had an election on the 26th of February, and then they had their revolution on that day. The voting decision of the people, which I don't like, but the voting decision was a very, very strong pronouncement on the previous government. That they blamed the government for everything, which is what happens in a democracy. I think there's a stoic attitude in Ireland as well. There is an acceptance that we didn't behave well as a community during the Celtic Tiger years. There was people lost control. There was extraordinary speculative activity in the building area, and although people are still very badly hurt by that, they do accept that we need to, I think, be a bit more realistic. I have to say the public sector in Ireland has come in for an awful lot of criticism in recent times, which I think is a bit unfair, because they have accepted very large salary cuts without the kind of protest that one would have expected elsewhere. Part of the reason for that is that over the last 2 decades we have built a unique social partnership model in which the trade unions and other social partners, the trade unions, the employers, the farming organisations, and the representatives of other parts of social society have played a big role, and it has certainly helped to ensure that there is a sign-up for the very difficult austerity measures. But as in other democracies, the politicians take the blame and very seldom get the credit when things go right.
Gràcies. Em sembla molt interessant reflexionar sobre aquesta actitud de la gent irlandesa i com explica el senyor Roche. Considera que la societat en general es va equivocar amb aquest excés de despesa que va tenir lloc durant el Tigre Celta i a les urnes expressar la seva desconformitat sense grans queixes. A mi em sembla un punt interessant, potser que es vol comentar des de l'audiència, des del públic. Endavant, segur que hi ha preguntes per fer sobre l'experiència irlandesa. Doncs, qui vol començar? Endavant, sisplau. Si vol dir el seu nom.
Yeah, thank you, Morten Hansen. Just one question there, and you sort of mentioned it already this year, that people were also a little bit oblivious to what happened and perhaps didn't want to sort of listen to that this year was overheated. But also, you had this guy Morgan Kelly, right, whom I think was quite early on spoke about that this was potentially very, very serious, but nobody really wanted to listen to him until later. Can you sort of perhaps elaborate a little bit on this? Thanks.
Morgan Kelly has become something as a legend in his own time. I have his article here in front of me. I anticipated that somebody would read it. For those of you not familiar, Morgan Kelly is a professor of economics in University College Dublin. His office is on the same floor as my office was on in the same university. Just to put it in context, Morgan Kelly did write a very scathing article a series of articles in 2007, 2006-2007, in which he actually made a point that the building and construction boom was going to blow up. It wasn't rocket science, I have to say. And while after the event his reputation has been, enhanced by the fact that he said this, at the time, not all of his articles were published because it didn't fit the zeitgeist of the time. He certainly was right. He made the point that every bubble burst at the end of the day, and he was right. He has recently published an article which says that Ireland's future depends absolutely on breaking free from the bailout. And throughout his thinking, he has been consistently making the point, really the moral hazard point, that it is necessary to default, that it is necessary that the people who provided money on a basis that they were reckless, that they too should pay the price. So it's a kind of a populist argument. To go back to his first analysis, where he said that you should stop the building boom, it's easy to say that. It's not very easy to do that. I mean, how do you actually stop a building boom? At the time, the laws of supply and demand were stood on their head in Ireland. I mentioned to you that in 2006, 90,000 new home units had been built. Now that was an oversupply of 100% on the market. You needed about 45,000 housing units a year in Ireland, and yet we're building twice that rate. But in spite of building twice that rate, prices in the market were escalating dramatically from week to week. So the market wasn't operating very logically. Now, if you apply the laws of supply and demand, if you were to say, well, you're only going to build 35,000 or 45,000 houses next year, the price will go up even higher still. Because the market wasn't responding logically, and it wasn't responding logically because of the availability of cheap capital. And that's why Morgan Kelly's analysis and the analysis of other people said that those who supplied the capital, that they're based on moral responsibility, and this is correct. But again, if you're part of the club, the big argument at the time of the bank bailout was that the government should have forced default, that it should have allowed banks to go to the wall. Again, I can see the logic of that. But if you were to do that, you would create chaos. Remember what happened when Northern Rock collapsed. I'm sorry, go back further. Go back to the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Was the administration in the United States right to let Lehman Brothers go to the wall? Would it have been less costly in the United States to support Lehman Brothers, even though Lehman Brothers behaved in a way that the company behaved was fundamentally stupid in its operations? But it would have been much cheaper to intervene than to not intervene. We know that. So there is a difficulty for anybody making the decisions at the particular point. Yes, it would have been very popular it would have been a good idea to curtail the building boom. But how do you do that? As it turns out, one of my ministerial responsibilities at the time was to deal with the issue of building land and the zoning for building land. And I was the first minister in the history of the state to actually prevent land being zoned for housing. I was nearly stoned out of the area that happened in. A prophet is never recognised in his own town, in his own time. And my colleague, my junior minister at the time, made several speeches about banks giving 100% mortgages. And he was attacked viciously in parts of the media as an idiot for making this. Now, Neuberg's report, which has been published recently, makes a point that there's a lot of responsibility across the whole of Irish society, that you're responsible for everything you do, that certainly government of the day carries primary responsibility for its operations. But he makes the point that there was society as a whole lost a sense of direction in this, and that it's easy after the event to analyse what should have been done. I think everybody was aware that there was a bubble. It was very, very obvious the bubble would burst. At the time, before the collapse of the banking, the hope was, and in fact the indications were, that we'd have a relatively soft landing. There were signs that logic was going to return to the building and construction industry, and that people were beginning to cool down. But unfortunately, the cooling down takes much longer to achieve than the burst. But Morgan Kelly's analysis, I mean, he has been vilified by some people, which is very unfair, because the fundamental points he's making are not incorrect. If you have a boom, if you lose any sense of direction, and you behave in a way that, you know, we behaved in, there is going to inevitably be pain. And that's all he's saying. And I mean, it's interesting that he makes the point here, for example, about the stress tests. He's scathing about the stress tests that you were talking about. The stress tests were stupid. I mean, the stress tests that were carried out about European banking, it was childish. And in fact, rather than achieve the objective of calming the concerns, the illogicality of the stress tests, I think, made the situation worse. So Morgan Kelly is making that point. He said, you know, dismay at home, he's attacking Honahan's judgment crystallized into outright skepticism after an extraordinary interview in Bloomberg, when in the 28th of May of 2010, when he talks about the aggressive stress tests. Sure, nobody believed that the stress tests were aggressive. So he's right there. He was talking out about the banks and the bank bailout. He actually makes the point that at the time government decisions were made, there was imperfect information available. Sorry, it wasn't imperfect information. It was a criminal withholding of information. There were lies told. Nobody knew the extent, for example, of what was happening until very recently, for example, Anglo, the bank that was at the center of this. And what Morgan Kelly is saying, that when you became aware of the extent of this, then it was time to revisit the guarantee. In other words, to start defaulting. But again, that wasn't a unilateral decision that you could take. So I have to say, I don't agree with the criticism that has been made of Kelly, but I believe that it's much easier from an academic's point of view to actually propose what should have done when you have 2020, the vision, as I have the benefit of 2020 hindsight, when you have all the information. It's different in the real world. But he has become something of a cult figure in Ireland. And if anybody knows Morgan Kelly, he doesn't want to be a cult figure. He's a quiet man. He doesn't want this. But he actually said the finance of the Irish government are like the bucket with a large hole in the form of the banking system. And he's right. That's what has happened. But it was easy in 2006, 2007 to say that building and construction was going too fast. But there was no practical way that you could stop it. It wouldn't have been a very popular government said, okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to close down 25% of the building and construction industry. We're going to make 250,000 workers redundant, and we're going to be better in the long term. Then the people would have been taking out the matches and setting government buildings on fire. So I see the point of his analysis. I think it was easier to make the analysis than it is to implement it. And some of the points he's making, though, are true. And I think that the lesson that has to be learned is going back about how regulation has failed. That's a point I fully agree with, about how how the stress testing of the banking system and how the examination of the banking system it was criminally ineffective. And he makes that point. And he also makes the point, he does take a strong view, which I'm inclined to share, that the conditions which were applied to Ireland were excessive, given that there was a belief at the time that we could have dealt with the problems. But particularly when there was briefing, I was very critical, I have to say, of briefing from certain personnel in the ECB. I thought that was very unhelpful. I thought that the sense of solidarity on which Europe is supposed to be built was not just breached, it was raped by those people who were anonymous and who had their own view as to what they wanted to see out of this. And so there was a sense, at least in government in Ireland and in the administration in Ireland, that we were sacrificed to the bigger, we were the sacrificial lamb to the bigger objective of returning some, of controlling. But if you're part of the Eurozone, if you decide to go to be part of the team, you have to play as a team. So it's not possible for a small government to decide, well, we're going to default, we're not going to abide by the rules. You just can't do that. It's not the way you behave. There was only one other point. I made it in the French Senate in February, when they were talking about the French taxpayers having to bail us out. They won't. They make a handsome profit out of bailing us out. And unlike France, Ireland has always paid its debts. By the way, there was one other point, just to make it. There's a lot of debate about who's going to go to the head of the IMF. I do hope that if Madame Lagarde goes to the head of IMF, she'll change her extraordinary views on taxation, because certainly if the views which she has advocated on CCCTB and on corporation profit tax are to be applied, the chances of Ireland's recovery are slim to nil. She knows my views on this, but.
Okay, Edward here, I'm from Barcelona, but I'm going to speak in English because maybe the other people participating in the group can understand it better. A couple of points, really. Just on the Morgan Kelly thing, you know, he's a quite, as you say, maybe he's a quiet character, but he appears to be quite an exotic character. You know, a much more conservative person here in Spain, or a much more conservative group of people here in Spain in 2006 saw all this coming, and they were the actual inspectors for the Bank of Spain who presented a report to the governor of the Bank of Spain at the time, saying that there was a property boom which was in danger of becoming a bubble taking place in the country, and it was time to act. And unfortunately, Jaime Caruana, who was the Director General or Governor at the time, just saw fit to file the report and go off to work with Rodrigo Rato in the International Monetary Fund in Washington, where he was able again to not foresee, according to the Independent Evaluation Organization, not foresee another crisis which is coming. So, I mean, yeah, some people have got a good record of seeing things, and other people have got a good record of not seeing things, and this is part of the problem. Now, the question is really, could we have done anything? Because, I mean, obviously now we can't do anything about not having done anything. But maybe if we want to learn the lessons for the future, we need to ask ourselves whether we could have done something at the time. You know, and I think there were people around who were thinking about this. One of the striking things about Honohan's what went wrong in Ireland thing is, for me, is the lack of kind of reflection about the monetary policy dimension of the situation. We say credit was freely available, there was a lot of liquidity. Why was there a lot of liquidity? You know, I mean, we need to dig back a bit deeper. All these things about these bankers going crazy. If you read an economic historian like Kindleberger, you know, you can find in every bubble and every boom in the whole of the history of modern industrial society, all these people have gone crazy. So what is it that makes the difference between the day you go crazy and the day, you know, you don't go crazy? I mean, there are other factors at work. And if we want to look at these situations analytically, we need to try to get to grips with the factors at work. Now, why did some people join the Eurozone and why didn't others join the Eurozone, for example? You know, some people didn't join the Eurozone not because they were Eurosceptics, simply because they were worried about the idea of having a single-size monetary policy for all economies. You know, that turns out to be quite a legitimate worry. Now, another Irish economist called Ahern, when he was working with the Bruegel think tank in Brussels, came up with a set of ideas of how to handle, you know, this difficulty about having a single-size monetary policy for everybody. He came up with two ideas. This was a little late in the day. I think he wrote this in 2008. But I mean, it's very interesting that this hasn't been picked up over in Frankfurt. They're not making some sort of public, a little bit of self-critique. I mean, the central bank of the central banks, no, in the Eurozone case, wants all the banks here in Spain or all the banks in Ireland to make a big, you know, flagellation in public about what went wrong. But I think it would be better in some ways if this started at the top. Now, one of the two proposals that were quite interesting, and which one of them you've picked up on here, which is fiscal policy. I mean, basically, one of the things you need to do if you've got this huge excessive demand building up in an economy that's destructuring, you know, the whole economic fabric, is to take demand out of the economy. So really we should have been advocating from Brussels and from Frankfurt, right from, you know, much earlier on in the situation, large fiscal surpluses. You know, I mean, funny enough, this is exactly the same thing we're going to see tomorrow about Latvia. You know, it's not only a Eurozone problem, it's a problem that affects those economies that were effectively Euroized around the Eurozone. And the second thing was more regulation. You also touched on that. But I mean, you know, for instance, why was nobody, in the UK, when they did the 5 tests about whether or not to enter the Eurozone, one of the key tests was the sensitivity of variable interest rate mortgages, you know, to movements in interest rates that you couldn't control. So why were so many variable rate mortgages allowed? I mean, here in Spain, 85% of mortgages are variable. I mean, this goes in a way creates a huge difficulty, like we're seeing at the moment now, where in a country like France, they badly need, because they're in danger in France now of having a property boom, interest rates to be raised. But here in Spain, you know, it's very, very difficult to
Perdó que interrompeixi, però potser agrairia brevetat perquè altres persones tinguin oportunitat de parlar.
Sí.
Si vol fer la pregunta específica, potser?
Sí, bueno, yes, okay. So don't you think we'd be better off, this is the whole background to this, if we made some kind of more positive or self-reflection on what we've done wrong, so that we can get things a bit better right in the future?
Gràcies.
Generally speaking, I mean, we underlined first that there were more at stake since the early beginning of the debt crisis. We said clearly that there was more at stake than financial stability of one member state or another. It was about the whole construction, basically, the economic and monetary union, an insufficient level of integration in terms of our economic policies. Therefore, this is why we are pushing for a completely reshuffle of our governance, of our economic governance in Europe, and more concretely, of course, in the euro area. We expect decisions to be confirmed during the month of June on a comprehensive package. Comprehensive package, its first pillar, of course, it's member states pursuing fiscal consolidation policies and structural reform, and I insist on the end, they go hand in hand. Secondly, completing financial repair, that's fundamental, and that's been addressed here before. Therefore, the next round of stress test is very relevant, strengthening the exercise, testing liquidity, enlarging the list of banks being tested, very rigorous macroeconomic scenarios, etc., etc. Supervision, we have the new bodies in place since January 2011. And then I would say, reinforcing the Stability and Growth Pact. And then it's very important that to understand that until now what we are doing is basically implementing surveillance on fiscal policies. But when it comes to macroeconomic policies, we have not much in our hands. And Lisbon Agenda, for instance, was a very interesting exercise, but there were it had no teeth. So this is why the proposals that we put on the table already in autumn last year, and we hope will be agreed, the economic governance package, which includes 6 different pieces of legislation, puts the accent first on having credible sanctions. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So, giving it some teeth. Implementing seriously, because it has never been seriously implemented, the debt criterion, and not only focusing on deficit, on excessive deficit, but also excessive debt. Therefore, be in a position that we can launch an excessive deficit procedure based on excessive debt. Having a credible benchmark for debt reduction, it's a yearly objective, 1/5 per year. And of course, it's not absolutely mathematic when it comes to debt. One has to see the wider picture and take into account relevant factors, for instance, private debt. But that's part of the exercise too, but also extending surveillance to macroeconomic policies to detect, to prevent macroeconomic imbalances, difference in competitiveness, and the root problems that that we haven't addressed in the past. For instance, bubbles in the housing sector, in the financial sector, etc., etc. And having also, why not, credible sanctions that could apply to excessive imbalances procedures. So all this is in the pipeline. This is the last mile, I would say, of this legislative process. It is a test. Of the political will of European governments. I must say that discussions with the European Parliament and the Council are progressing well. There is widespread consensus that the system must be credible, and it's not only about to convince ourselves and to convince the President of the ECB and our friends in Washington and even in Beijing, but it's about convincing the market participants first and foremost. Because this crisis is also about recovering some credibility, restoring confidence in the markets about the capacity of the Economic and Monetary Union to function properly and to deal with major crises. And you cannot exclude completely other crises in the future. And finally, the last element of the comprehensive response, of course, that attracts media attention very often is the financial backstops. That will become permanent and will replace the temporary financial backstops that we have nowadays in place, the European Stability Mechanism, to mention it. Just my contribution, maybe Mr. Roche.
I absolutely agree, and there is no point whatsoever in having really well-structured plans if you don't have teeth in them. Yeah, I mean, and this is the issue. It's perhaps disingenuous to remind people that the first people who broke the arrangements were the French and the Germans. Nobody was talking about backstops then when the initial problems happened. Edward mentioned a couple of points which I think deserve just a brief reference back. Morgan Kelly's point is about moral hazard. And he's talking about that if people who are in pursuit of profit don't face the consequence of their making wrong decisions, then they'll continue to pursue profit. And this raises the whole structure of the banking system right across the world, not just in Europe. The fact that officials in banking received vulgar, abusive payments for criminal activity. I mean, and very few people have ended in jail. 3, I think, have ended in jail in the United States. The system, the culture, for example, in London is no less predatory than it was. I mean, there are people getting these extraordinary and grotesque bonuses for taking risks, and they themselves never bear any consequence to those risks. There's a problem there. There's a problem with supervision. Alan Ahern, who you mentioned, Alan Ahern really was a kind of latter day. He's reread Keynes. He's talking about pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical policies. Of course, he's quite correct. But and people in Ireland now advocate those policies too. But the point is, when you go back and you actually look at what happened when we actually had very big surpluses, when, for example, Charlie McCreevy created the National Pension Fund. And because he didn't want any other Minister for Finance dipping into that, he statutorily protected it against, so it actually has a statutory protection, can only be used for certain things. There was a huge amount of, we should use it for infrastructure, we should do this, we should do that. The temptation of the day, and the political temptation of the day is inevitably wins out. But I do think that the point you're making, that the test of political will for EU governance is something that the European states have to face up to. There was a very interesting and telling moment in the Convention on the Future of Europe back in 2002-2003, when Giscard d'Estaing chastised a number of impotent small and medium-sized member states when he said, surely you can't believe that the same rules will apply to you as applied to France or Germany. Well, yes, that's the whole point. If you're going to be equal, you're equal. You're not half equal, you're fully equal. And I think that there has to be the kind of point that has been made. I do believe that there's some fundamental errors. The separation, for example, of the old traditional central banking responsibilities from bank regulation, certainly in the Irish case, led to confusion. Who does what? The Department of Finance didn't want to, and Neuberg makes this point very well, didn't want to interfere with the central bank, and the central bank didn't want to interfere with the regulator. So nobody wanted to interfere with anybody else, and the economy went down the tubes. I also find the point about lending policies. The lending policies that have been introduced have been absolutely wrong. There was a French, I can't remember who it was, wrote a paper not too terribly long ago in defence of a return to more traditional banking policies, particularly for the main retail banking. And I think he was absolutely right. Fiscal, yes, I made that point. I think there needs to be better supervision. And I think I actually do agree with the central point that Kelly is making here and that you've made. A little bit of sackcloth and ashes in Frankfurt will go a long way too, because there were certainly some fundamental errors made there. There has been bad slip-ups, and if we don't learn the lessons of history, we're condemned to repeating the same mistakes. And the people who suffer always are the small people. They're the taxpayers. They're the people who, in this country, young people who don't have jobs, young people who don't have jobs in my country. They didn't create the problems, but they're paying the cost. So we do need to learn from the lessons. And I think that the point that you were making about, you have to put teeth into the process in Europe. We're either serious about this or we're not. And the measure of our seriousness will be the fact that we're willing to do this. But it's easier to talk in theory, and it's great when you're not in government to talk about these things. It's more hard in practice.
La següent pregunta. Tenim encara alguns minuts. Us animo a participar. Encara ens queden uns 10 minuts aproximadament.
Miranda Zaf, I have a question for both speakers on the Irish banking system. Looking forward, do you think that the 24 billion euros set aside for banker capitalization will be enough to address the problem permanently, or do you see a risk that non-performing loans and a further drop in asset prices might necessitate further interventions? And if so, could these interventions take the form of forcing holders of bank debt to convert the debt to equity? And if so, what would be the consequences in the rest of the euro area? Thank you.
Very shortly, I already touched on this point. The national stress tests that were carried out and were published on the 31st of March in Ireland are considered to be extremely rigorous in terms of capital requirements, access to liquidity. They are based on very, very rigorous macroeconomic scenarios. They take into account lots of risks, and they cover the eventualities that you mentioned. So the estimate of 24 billion euros is largely covered by the program, and I think that the reaction among market participants, not to refer only to the institutional reactions, are there to prove that there is, for the first time in this process, a significant level of certainty about the boldness of the exercise, the size of the damage done, and also the way forward. So indeed there are risks, and I mentioned that at the beginning of my presentations, there are uncertainties in financial markets, but we consider that these tests were done, let's say, put the country on the safe side for any of these eventualities. I don't know if Mr. Roche wants to elaborate more on this.
I think the point made about the more recent stress tests is correct. They're on the least optimistic scenarios. I mean, the scenarios are very, very gloomy, very black in some cases, and I think that I would have reason for optimism. You mentioned the non-performing loans and further asset drop. And you asked the question about the conversion of debt to equity. I actually think that there is justification for that. In fact, I do believe that there's justification for the very points that have been made by a couple of critics of what has happened in Ireland, and justification for making bondholders pay some consequence. Chancellor Merkel, in her speech of last September, October, she was making that point. I think that's for the future. You can't, in the process, though, you can't change that. I think in the future there has to be something, there has to be some moral hazard entered into it. So I do believe that the most recent stress test, I think it's far more realistic than the previous one. I also believe, by the by, that the assets which have been taken, that the NAMA process which has been put in place and which was so derided when it was first put in place, I think it will pay in the long run. And there's some signs that it's already having a positive effect. I was speaking in Sweden to a colleague. When they had their similar body to NAMA first set up, there was a lot of cynicism it wouldn't work, but it has worked. After some adjustments and some tweaking, it worked. And I think that will happen. I know that I was listening recently to the chairman of the National Asset Management Agency in Ireland. He was very hard-nosed that, and I think that has resonated positively. But I believe that the most recent stress tests are good. I do believe that there is a case to be made for forcing people who just threw money into banks that they didn't have any sense that there was ever going to be realised that they should perhaps bear some of the consequence, and the way might be to put it into equity. I think that's quite an elegant solution, but it's not a solution that any default. We had a big debate on default in Ireland. Default in any format, in any form, was not an option that I think you unilaterally could take. You're either in the Euro Club or you're not in the Euro Club, and if you're in the club, you play by the rules. Maybe we should look in the long term at changing the rules, but you can't change them halfway through the game.
Alguna altra intervenció? Mentre us aneu pensant, encara tenim alguns minuts. M'agradaria preguntar si breument em poden dir si tenen alguna opinió clara sobre el possible rescat que en algunes vegades als mitjans de comunicació s'ha parlat en el cas espanyol. Senyor Altafaj, sisplau.
Em temo que no et donaré cap breaking news sobre aquest assumpte. Ho discutíem ahir al vespre amb l'Eduard, per exemple. Clarament, la pressió ha disminuït en els mercats del deute, però d'aquí a dir que Espanya està fora de la zona de risc hi ha encara una distància molt important, i és molt important no pecar d'un excés de confiança. Espanya és un país que té més encara 20% d'atur, que té un creixement moderat, per no dir feble. Les nostres previsions que hem publicat ara recentment són una mica menys optimistes que les de les autoritats espanyoles. Creiem que el creixement hauria d'estar en torn al 0,8% aquest any. Per tant, un creixement força moderat. El sector immobiliari en particular continua caient, i per tant hi ha molts elements, a més de totes les tensions existents en l'entorn internacional, que advoquen per una actitud prudent. És cert que Espanya ha emès signes positius per calmar aquestes tensions, per exemple, senzillament el compliment de l'objectiu de dèficit per l'any passat, com havia estat acordat amb els seus socis europeus, i per tant el dèficit del 9,2 l'any passat és una dada que reconforta aquells que esperen que hi hagi una predictibilitat, diguéssim, en l'esforç d'ajust pressupostari. A partir d'aquí, bé, les autoritats espanyoles han de continuar l'esforç de consolidació pressupostària, però al mateix temps, en paral·lel, l'un no va sense l'altre, un cop més, continuar a les reformes estructurals que poden fer que l'economia espanyola augmenti aquest potencial de creixement que avui en dia és massa baix. i que generi, parlant d'una forma més general, un altre model de creixement econòmic, un canvi radical de l'activitat econòmica. El sector de la construcció no tornarà a ser el que era i, per tant, com a bon pare de família, és bo posar els ous en diferents cistells i aprofitar aquesta crisi com una oportunitat per reveure el model econòmic de l'Estat espanyol, una mica en línia amb el que deia ahir el president Mas en la conferència inaugural, i per tant apostar per una economia del coneixement, apostar per una economia més sostenible, una economia més verda. Són bàsicament els eixos que estan a la iniciativa Europa 2020, que potser alguns de vosaltres coneixeu, i no posar parxes a l'economia. Amb pedaços no ens en sortirem. Però això no és un problema exclusivament espanyol, és un problema que va més enllà. És a dir, l'alternativa és l'alternativa dels pedaços i, per tant, conformar-se amb un creixement moderat o gairebé una estancació en la pròxima dècada, o bé adaptar els nostres models econòmics i tenir un creixement que pot garantir-nos que podem mantenir l'estat del benestar al que els nostres ciutadans aspiren i que fa la diferència, diguéssim, del model econòmic europeu. No té per què ser contradictori tenir un model que genera un creixement econòmic, evidentment no amb unes xifres com les de les economies emergents del sud-est asiàtic, Xina, Brasil, etc., però sí un creixement generador de riquesa i generador, a més, de garanties que el model social que els nostres ciutadans volen mantenir pot ser sostenible al mitjà i llarg termini. M'he estès una mica.
No, moltes gràcies. Anything, would you like to add? Anything else?
Well, given that we're here, I thought I'd read you just two things. Edward mentioned Morgan Kelly. Morgan Kelly's thesis, by the way, is that the Irish bailout is not really to rescue. The terms of the Irish bailout are so severe, not because they want to help the Irish economy, but his thesis is that it really is to send a lesson to Spain. But he finishes with a lovely analysis here, and I just read it. He said, back when the euro was being planned in the mid-1990s, it never occurred to anybody that cautious, stodgy banks like Allied Irish and the Bank of Ireland, run by faintly dim former rugby players, could borrow tens of billions overseas and then lose it on dodgy property loans. By the way, the faintly dim rugby player he's referring to is a very distinguished former commissioner, Peter Sutherland. I don't know why he dislikes Peter Sutherland, but whoever. The point he's making there again was that there is a fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that we've applied a fairly loose formula across the whole of the Eurozone, and we actually didn't really take into account the fact that these things could happen. There was a best scenario, and people never looked at a worst scenario. And what has actually happened, of course, is that without having the regulation that you need in place, and without actually having the moral hazard for individual actions in place, people played as they always do. They played the worst game, and the taxpayers are picking up the consequences. So there's a great deal of truth in what he's saying, although I go back to it, a lot of it is with the benefit of 2020 hindsight. But the lesson for us all is to learn from this, to actually put the teeth into the European system, to create a real system. We can't be halfway there. And we have to have a system that will apply to everybody and that will have fairly good automaticity, and that raises a whole series of issues relating to sovereignty that member states will have to bite that bullet and get on with the job, because we can't be halfway involved. We have to be either wholly involved or not involved at all.
Ara sí, donaré pas a la darrera pregunta, breument, perquè no tenim gaire temps i ens agradaria fer un cafè i continuar parlant sobre aquests temes d'una manera més informal. Endavant.
Hola, jo soc Maria Àngels Fitó i volia fer una pregunta molt concreta. En la darrera qüestió s'ha debatut sobre quina podria ser la situació o l'evolució d'Espanya en aquest context de crisi del sistema financer. Jo voldria anar una mica més al detall i preguntar, en aquest sentit, des de la visió privilegiada que pot tenir el senyor Altafaj com a català expert en afers econòmics de la Comissió Europea, és quin pot ser el futur de Catalunya tenint en compte la limitació que suposa, en aquest cas, ser una nació sense estat. És a dir, quin hauria de ser el paper de les institucions nostres, les institucions catalanes, en aquest context de reglobalització. S'ha parlat, ja que de fet tots tenim clar que de la crisi no ens sortirem igual que n'hem entrat. Moltes gràcies.
És una pregunta molt difícil i molt política catalana, espanyola, més que europea, de fet. Està clar que, donat la importància que té la gestió pressupostària en un estat descentralitzat, en un estat... Espanya no és l'únic cas, hi ha altres països també que tenen aquesta descentralització de la despesa. Estendre aquest control, aquest ajust de forma correcta és un exercici polític molt difícil. Els desenvolupaments, els aconteixements en aquest sentit, com sabeu, es segueixen molt de prop també per part de la premsa internacional en aquests moments. És a dir, el debat català, el debat fiscal català, l'ajust pressupostari que està a punt de materialitzar el govern en els pròxims pressupostos, se segueix molt de prop des d'Europa, des dels mitjans de comunicació, des de les agències de rating, les famoses agències, i per tant és un test de credibilitat exterior. No tinc gaire més a dir, sinó que les xifres hauran de ser convincents no només a nivell de l'estat espanyol, però això se seguirà molt de prop i pot tenir un impacte, potencialment pot tenir un impacte en l'evolució del deute espanyol en els mercats en les pròximes setmanes i mesos. I per tant, quan estic parlant que Espanya encara no pot dir que està completament fora de la zona de risc, també faig referència a elements d'aquest tipus de naturalesa política. És a dir, si hi ha un dubte en la capacitat d'algunes comunitats autònomes de contribuir a l'esforç pressupostari que Espanya ha subscrit a nivell europeu i els objectius no es poden complir, això pot amplificar aquests riscos i per tant pot precipitar una situació que no voldríem veure. Per tant, és una discussió molt sensible, entren en joc molts components i vaig sentir ahir el discurs inaugural del president Mas. Crec que hi ha una clara presa de responsabilitat que va més enllà de Catalunya en el seu discurs i hi ha una visió clara de la importància de l'estabilitat financera a Catalunya en el context europeu actual. I també hi ha una visió clara, i això també mereix ser saludat, de la crisi com a oportunitat de fer reformes importants que puguin augmentar, per exemple, el potencial de les exportacions catalanes i la projecció de Catalunya, la projecció internacional de Catalunya. I aquest és precisament l'eix vertebrador de l'estratègia Europa 2020. Aprofitar aquesta crisi com una oportunitat per tenir economies on es diversifica més el model de creació de riquesa, apostar per l'educació en el sentit més ampli, no només a nivell de l'escola, sinó a nivell de les universitats, de la formació al llarg de la vida, per exemple, de la integració entre el món universitari i el món empresarial, millorar el marc legislatiu, per exemple, en termes d'accés al crèdit per part de les petites i mitjanes empreses, el crèdit a risc, que se'n diu també, i tota una sèrie de mesures de tipus legislatiu, del marc legislatiu, que poden impulsar l'activitat econòmica. Perquè no es tracta només d'un esforç de consolidació fiscal, sinó hi ha un nou model de creació de riquesa. És evident que que per molt que s'ajustin els comptes públics no es aconseguirà sortir d'aquesta situació d'estancament potencial que em referia a la pregunta anterior.
Alguna cosa a afegir per acabar? Mr. Roche, anything to add? Would you like to add on this?
Well, I don't know enough about the position here to add to it, but I think that we've had a very good discussion about the lessons that can be learned from our mistakes, and we made some pretty good mistakes, pretty bad mistakes. So there is really easy lessons to be made there. I do agree with the point that's been made, though, that we need to start looking around in Europe, a new economic model that actually focuses on social solidarity more, and that looks and plays to the strengths of Europe. For a long time, when I was lecturing in university, it always frustrated me that we spoke in the area I was interested in, public administration, administrative theory, always from American theories. I actually think that there's a need to build a thesis in Europe as to the way that we deal with it, based on it, not on the pursuit of the maximum profit from the shortest period of time, but in fact on social solidarity, on building to your strengths, cultural and human strengths over a period of time. I think there are lessons to be learned there. I actually think that Europe needs to be more self-confident about itself. I think that we do need, in the context of the European Union and in the context of the euro, we need to build mechanisms that will work, and we need to be quite careful to preserve good and sometimes conservative practices that have existed. The Irish banking collapse is a classic example. Whether you agree with Morgan Kelly about faintly dim former rugby players running banks, the reality of it was there was a system that worked. The new system that was introduced didn't work, and it has produced chaos. And I believe that the new system that we borrowed in Europe, a lot of it was influenced, a lot of thinking in banking and banking regulation was influenced by the states. If there was a real villain of the piece, I actually blame Greenspan, the idea of continuing low interest rates, low regulation. I just think that policy hasn't worked. It has caused chaos internationally, and it has caused untold misery for hundreds of millions of people. So maybe we should look at a different model, and maybe in Europe we should be sufficiently self-confident to craft a model which is European, which is based on the best aspects of the solidarity that we have in Europe. And then I think that we can have a counterforce in terms of world economic debate. I was recently in China, just come from China, and it's interesting that the Chinese are looking at, they're not at all sold on the model that has been proposed of low regulation. They're looking for a mixed economy model. So maybe we should look at something similar. I think the next few months and weeks and months and years are going to be a very interesting time. They're going to be trying time for Europe, because basically I've led the Irish in 3 referenda on Europe, because I believe very strongly in Europe. But I do believe that we have to fully engage, and governments have to make tough decisions about creating mechanisms, giving them teeth, and giving them a fair trial. We can't, as we're doing, shift around and let the winds of the day blow us in a particular direction. We have to have a course and move on that course.
Moltes gràcies, senyor Dick Roche, senyor Amadeu Altafaj. Moltes gràcies per les seves paraules. Crec que no ens queda dubtes de que Irlanda passarà a millors temps ben aviat. Com hem dit, és una economia molt sòlida, és una economia de grans exportacions, unes exportacions que no fan més de créixer. Les dades ens diuen que és el 6è país en productivitat, és a dir, hi ha moltes raons per ser optimistes pel futur d'Irlanda. Des de Catalunya, Irlanda ha estat sempre un país de referència, un país que ens genera molta admiració per molts aspectes, i esperem que les relacions entre Catalunya i Irlanda continuïn existint, polítiques, acadèmiques, socials, d'estudis. Només em caldria afegir un petit to d'optimisme amb què Obama es dirigia a la plaça College Green fa pocs dies i citava el poeta. La nostra responsabilitat comença als nostres somnis, aquests somnis que siguin positius per als 2 països. Esperem que sigui així.